Coming to you from the shores of the Aegean Sea and the shores of the Atlantic, it's time for the Thursday Freedom Hub show, where we take a deeper look at some of the bigger issues which define us and affect us. Hi, I'm Jim Graypeck. I'm joined by my co-host Charlie Froman. We have a great show for you today, and if you're new to the channel, let's first do a little bit of housekeeping. I will find that screen share. And our website, our URL is your-mp.com. MP stands for Marketplace, your marketplace for health, wealth, and freedom, which is what it's all about. And if you slide over on the tabs past your health, your wealth, and go to your media hub, you will find information on who we have upcoming on the Wednesday and Thursday show. Yesterday's show is on health biz, the health business, healthcare, and so on. And then Thursday is we take a deeper look at those bigger issues. Down at the bottom are the channels we post the videos on, usually weekend or certainly by Monday. BitChute, Brighteon, YouTube when it's not too spicy, and Rumble. So that should cover us, I think, Charlie. And let me turn that back over to you and to introduce our guest.
Yeah, just one correction. I'm not quite on the shores of the Atlantic. I'm on the shores of a river emptying into a bay that's connected to the ocean, the James River, actually. And the topic today, it's sort of human weakness. So many of us get caught up with the demagoguery of protectionism. And those pushing protectionism don't call it that. They call it, I guess, in the case of RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr., whom a lot of us like in the Democrat primary, he calls it the Peace Dividend that never was post collapse of the communist bloc in 1989. MAGA, of course, was Trump's version of bringing the jobs back. And as Professor Magness is going to present, this is not a new concept. It pretty much is one of the definitions of our origin, I would say, even between Washington's cabinet members, Jefferson at State and Hamilton at Treasury. Of course, the demagogues always win. Just tax those foreigners on their imports, let them pay the taxes and revenue, and let's spend it on internal improvements back then. And of course, today it's maybe it's the grid that Kennedy says we need to give us his free energy from the solar panels and windmills, or of course the roads, bridges, and rail, harbors. Let's just build our infrastructure and attract those manufacturing jobs back, and we'll all be happy. We'll probably get into hypocrisy too, because Lord Acton said power corrupts. And even our libertarian founders, our favorites, Jefferson and his followers, Madison and Monroe, weren't pure. It was one of them that renewed the central bank and allowed tariffs to be passed. It had their own set of internal improvements with canals and the National Pike Road up there in Maryland. But, we have to resist if we want to have that city on the hill, that ideal republic. We're going to have some kind of economic collapse. Everyone warns, who knows when. Phil was educated at George Mason, the college just outside of DC in Northern Virginia, that has become sort of a free market mecca, along with a few other colleges across the country. When I was a congressional staffer, George Mason is the place you want to look at to get a master's or a PhD in econ. They have the law and economics program too, which is a nifty sounding combo. He has taught various econ, public policy courses, the economic divide at several colleges over many years. Now he's a senior research faculty at AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research. And with that, Phil, tell us about the demagoguery of protectionism. It's always there and it always works.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone, for having me on the program today. This is a topic that's been quite a bit in the news lately. There's been a pretty heavy discussion about the revival of protectionism, and the question being, is this something that has broken a consensus of the past 50 or 60 years toward trade liberalization? And one of the oddities of it is you're really seeing a horseshoe theory play out here. The pressure for protectionism is coming from both the political left and the political right at the same time. You are seeing it argued by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the left. And then you have Marco Rubio is making some of the same arguments from the right. And you read their plans, you put them side by side, it's often very similar to what they're doing. Now, the other oddity of this is it's not something that most people would have predicted as recently as maybe 20, 25 years ago that protectionism would be back. It always had a minority lingering under the political discussion of mostly labor unions argued for it in the 1980s and 1990s. Sometimes foreign policy hawks argued for it, but it was seen as something that had been defeated in the past. And really, some of the figures we're going to talk about today, I can remember all the way back in grad school, which was just under 2 decades ago. If I wanted to find the republished works of Henry Clay and Henry Charles Carey, who was one of the economists he draws on, they were very difficult to obtain in print even. One of the only places that you could even go to get them was something known as the Lyndon LaRouche movement. If any of you remember that, Lyndon LaRouche was the standard bearer for what was called the American system in the 1990s. And he was a really fringe kind of third-party perennial candidate for the presidency. So that just shows how much movement there's been on this issue. The American system in the 1990s was viewed as a fringe relic of the past, and now you have both mainstream parties talking about it. And one of the things I want to do today is walk you through the history of how this happened. And that starts with an investigation of what the American system is. To do that, I am going to open up a slideshow here and give you a couple pictures of some of the figures that are involved, when this occurred. And one of the fun things about the history of protectionism in the United States is it's really one of the very first political issues that even comes onto the agenda in Congress. And the question that we start with is, what is a tariff? It's a tax. And it's also a special kind of tax because it's one that is nominally sanctioned in the original tax clause of the Constitution. And you can see that right there. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. The interesting term here is the impost. That was the 18th century synonym for what we now call a tariff. An impost was a tax on foreign goods. And if you go back to the Constitutional Convention, they have a lengthy discussion. Remember, one of the reasons that they even met to form a new constitution is that they thought that the national tax power was inadequate. Now, that's an open debate for another time, but the argument was made that the federal government had no means to raise taxes without the consent of each of the states. So they established a national tax power. Madison in his notes even says this is the main reason we came together here is to create a tax power, and that tax power was premised on these 3 areas: duties, imposts, and excises. And the impost is the tax on foreign goods. But it was also a very narrow definition of a tax on foreign goods. If you read James Madison's notes and letters to his wife and all the documents he has from that era, he thinks it's going to be a single flat tax rate on all goods that cross the border. So it'd be like a sales tax. On rum comes in from the Caribbean, it's taxed at 5%. Woolens come in from European continent textile mills, they're taxed at 5%. Iron comes from Great Britain, it's taxed at 5%. No matter the good, a single flat tax rate. And that was the original design. We know this because Madison in 1789, after the new Constitution is adopted, in the very first Congress, he authors the bill to impose the first tariff of the United States. And he puts it up for debate and he says the tariff of the United States shall essentially be blank. And he asks Congress to fill in the blank. One of the shortest tax bills in history. And they start debating, and someone may propose, like, well, we should set it at 3%. And someone else will say, well, we get more revenue at 5%, 6% is too high. So they go back and forth on the debate over the tax bill. And then a couple rounds into it, there's a representative from Western Pennsylvania who stands up and says, this is all fine. You can set your rate whatever you want, but my district, we have an iron industry that's in its infancy, and it faces unfair competition from abroad. We'd like to charge a higher rate. So maybe if you set the rate on iron at 10% instead of 5%, this will help our industry develop. And this gives ideas to every other congressman, because the next thing you know, you've got the sheep farmer in New Hampshire says, well, what about wool? Can I get a better rate on that? And then you have the textile mill in Massachusetts, the representative from that district say, can I get a better rate on that? The glass manufacturer, the lead manufacturer, you name it. They all start raising their hands and proposing amendments. And we have a letter from Madison to his wife that essentially is saying, I don't know what's happening here. All hell has broken loose. We thought this was going to be an easy bill to pass through, and it's 2 weeks later, and we're still debating all these different rates that are coming through. So he's really kind of blindsided by this. The main architect of the Constitution doesn't realize the Pandora's box he'd opened because of protectionism. Now, they give a very mildly protectionist tariff that is enacted, but then some problems start to emerge, and the problems come out of the Washington administration, and one person in particular, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, 2 years later, issues a report out of the Treasury Department where he makes a formal argument for infant industry protection, giving favors with the tax rate to industries we want to cultivate and protect from foreign competition, that main foreign competition being places like the United Kingdom, Great Britain. We had just won the war against them. It's like, well, we don't want them dominating our commerce. It's a very nationalistic type of an argument. Now, there's some ambiguity because Hamilton uses the report to lay out the theory behind all of these things, but it's not quite sure which component he is advocating. He probably wanted to go in a fairly protectionist direction. At least that's the argument I make, because there are some other letters from earlier in his career where he does advocate trade protectionism on similar grounds. But there's a debate in Congress on whether and how far they should enact the proposals made by Alexander Hamilton. As we all know, Hamilton starts to get into feuds with everyone else in the US government at the time, basically. James Madison is still a member of Congress, and Madison starts to align with the Jeffersonian wing. The first political parties emerge around Jefferson. He called them the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans at the time, although it's a different lineage than today's Republican Party. And Hamilton forms the Federalist Party. And throughout the 1790s, these are the two contested positions in the US government. The Federalists tend to favor a much stronger central government. They favor things like a national bank. And in fact, they pushed the first bank of the United States through. That's Alexander Hamilton's baby. He also pushes through at least an agenda that has some moderately protectionist tariffs. So raising the rates above that original 1789 bill that Madison dealt with and proposed in Congress. So there's an upward pressure coming from Alexander Hamilton. He also starts to pair it with a more active central government, a government that takes on expenditures to build roadways and subsidize the expansion of harbors and docking systems and canals. And these are referred to as internal improvements. There's a big debate in the 1790s because these are not specified in the Constitution. Unlike the tariff clause, which is there, there's no clause that says internal improvements. And what they do is they kind of slip it through the back door. They use the fuzzy language of the enumerated powers. It says Congress can do things to promote the general welfare of the United States, and that's seen as a license. Well, anything that's good for the welfare of the United States will say internal improvements, harbor improvements, that helps the welfare of the United States, therefore it's constitutional. Whereas Jeffersonians are saying, wait a minute, we don't believe this. You kind of pull the fast one on us. This isn't within Congress's power. And several early court cases, several early political debates, really from about the 1790s till the 1820s, are over the constitutionality of all of these measures that plays out. Of course, we know Hamilton very famously dies in a duel with Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States. And that kind of puts an end to his presence in the American political system. And he does so at a time after Jefferson has been elected president, and Madison is coming in as like Jefferson's chief protege, designated successor. Madison becomes president after Jefferson. So there's a whole lineage of the Jeffersonian era where that is the political party that's won, and the Federalists basically fade away into obscurity. And by the 1810s, they're barely even able to run candidates anymore. The party's dissolved and fractured, and just gone by the wayside. Other interesting events happen in the 1810s. Most notably, we have a war with Great Britain. And part of that war brings about de facto cutoff of trade with the British Empire. There is an embargo that comes in at the very tail end of the Jefferson administration. It's one of the major steps toward the war, and then the war itself is a mechanism that cuts off trade. So it's not a tariff, but it is a cutoff of trade. And people start to realize during the War of 1812, hey, domestic industries can now charge a higher price because they don't face foreign competition. The war ends in 1815, 1816, Congress starts debating, well, its peace has returned again. We need to revamp the tax system of the United States. And what do they do? Well, James Madison comes along and he kind of reverses his position from earlier. He says, well, we can tolerate and let a little of a tariff come through. So they get tariffs again in 1816. Give you a little history there. You can see the chart from where it takes off afterward. Unfortunately, we don't have good data prior to about 1820, but the orange line there represents the average tariff rate of the United States over most of the last 200 years. And the blue line is it's the tariff rate on total imports. The orange line is the one dutiable imports, anything that's subject to taxes, because there are some categories that are always going to be duty-free regardless. But you can see most of the 19th century, it goes up and down and up and down, up and down until really right after the Civil War. So this is representative of the debate, the tension that's emerging between the protectionists will come into power, they'll raise the tariff rates, then the free traders will come into power, they'll lower the tariff rates, back and forth. And you see a couple clear victories for the protectionists. So from about 1820 till 1828, it's referred to as the Tariff of Abominations. Protectionists are ascendant. We'll talk about the reason why in a moment. Tariff of Abominations sparks something called the nullification crisis. The state of South Carolina basically threatens to refuse to enforce the tariff in its borders, and kind of hints that they may leave the Union. And there's almost a collision of forces in the national government because it pitted the president, Andrew Jackson, against his own vice president, who was from South Carolina, John Calhoun. And they had differences of opinion on this particular issue. It eventually ends up with Calhoun resigning the vice presidency to take a seat in the U.S. Senate, where he thinks he can be more effective in pushing this issue. But eventually in 1833, what happens is both sides agree to a mutual de-escalation, and that's why you see tariffs starting to go down from about the mid-1830s until the eve of the Civil War. And it shoots back up again in the Civil War. We'll return to that in a moment. But one of the underlying factors here is a process we refer to, economists refer to as rent seeking. And this is the mechanism. It's a term it's an academic term that describes how private interest groups try to use the power of government, the power of the state, to manipulate market exchange in their favor. And we know all about this today. We see this as special interest, pork barrel subsidies, everything that's taken home to the district. These are like quintessential forms of rent seeking. When the ethanol industry mandates that corn be added into gasoline, that's a form of rent seeking. It gives them a favor. And, you know, they always say we're doing this for the public good, but it's really the personal gain that comes back from it. And why I mention this term is tariffs are the classical economic example of rent extraction, of rent seeking, because they always have a private beneficiary. When you raise the price on goods coming in from abroad, you are benefiting the domestic firm that builds or makes or manufactures that good by allowing them to charge higher prices. They get more money in return to themselves. That is the rent that they've extracted. And who is harmed by this? Consumers at large, because we all have to pay higher prices. So basic political economy here, tariffs are quintessential rent seeking. Now, what happens? Well, in 1824, that original founding generation has retired from politics. Hamilton's been dead for 2 decades. Madison and Jefferson are still alive, but they've left the presidency. They've retired to their homes, their estates. The new generation that's moved in, including this fellow that is the U.S. Senator from Kentucky. He serves Secretary of State and a variety of other positions throughout a very long political career, but that is Henry Clay. And in 1824, this is the aftermath of these tariff hikes that come from the wake of the War of 1812. Clay goes to the U.S. Senate and he gives a very widely covered and circulated and famous speech where he articulates a case for what he calls the American system of economic theory. And he did this to compare and contrast it basically with the British system. And the British system is his characterization of Adam Smith and the theory of free trade and non-intervention. The American system, which he says this is, he's branding it this way for a reason. He's saying, we are a different country. We are a new country. We have a different core political philosophy. And he draws bits and pieces of his ideas off of Alexander Hamilton's old theoretical writings in favor of tariffs. And he starts to pair it in a multi-plank platform that he starts to present in this speech. He says, we need protective tariffs to foster and cultivate strategic industries of the United States, give them favors. You see how this would pair up with rent seeking pretty closely. He says, we also take some of the money raised by those protective tariffs and we redirect it to federal infrastructure projects, the internal improvements. On top of this, he's looking around and notices the United States is now a much bigger country in 1824. It's bought the Louisiana Purchase, has all these western lands it wants to settle. And he says, this is a cash opportunity. The federal government can also sell off land and use the proceeds of the land sales to do further internal improvements, national expenditure projects. And if that doesn't get us enough, we also have a Bank of the United States, which can debt finance through lending to the government, essentially lending to itself under political control. So he is bringing this all together in really, it starts as a 3-plank program: protective tariffs, internal improvements, and then finance mechanisms through land and debt. And then he also realizes there's another problem. That problem is, if you use the protective tariff to cultivate the home industry, you also end up unintentionally subsidizing the slave plantation system because you're redirecting trade from the South to the North and vice versa, rather than it going abroad, and you're doing so at a higher price. And this is actually an intentional part of the system. And he realized this did not settle all that well with some of the anti-slavery and abolitionist voters he was trying to court. Even though he's a slave owner himself, he does share some of the founding generation's belief that slavery is a problem and eventually needs to be weaned out of the United States system. But he realizes that his economic pattern is going to unite these things together and actually end up unintentionally subsidizing slavery. So he adds a 4th plank to that, and that is use more of this money, the federal money that's been raised from all these mechanisms, to subsidize the colonization of slaves as they are freed overseas back in Liberia. So this is the origin of the founding of Liberia. All comes out of the American system, and Henry Clay eventually becomes president of the American Colonization Society, which sponsors the colony of Liberia of sending freed slaves to the United States back to Africa. And he wants federal subsidies for this. And this becomes the core of his political platform for basically the remainder of his career. He makes multiple runs for the presidency on it. He gives famous speeches in Congress, sponsors bills. It is one of the major factions of U.S. politics from about the 1820s until his death in the early 1850s. So a dominant figure of his era. He doesn't always win, but it's certainly there. Now, the other interesting tidbit, he's trying to brand this as the American system, and he's trying to wrap it up in the legacy of Alexander Hamilton to contrast to the British, but he's got a little bit of a problem. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson are still alive when he delivers this speech. and they both receive copies of it. Jefferson's at Monticello. Madison's just up the road at Montpelier, which is his plantation in Virginia. They're essentially neighbors. They regularly visit each other and dine with each other, and they both get copies out of Washington of Henry Clay's speech, and they're horrified. They view this as the return of not only the worst of Alexander Hamilton, but the elevation of a new doctrine like Hamilton on steroids, run amok in a centralization of American power. And we know this because Madison, after reading the speech, he writes a letter to Henry Clay. And the gist of the letter is, I read your speech. It's very eloquently delivered and defended, but I don't think what you're doing is constitutional. It stretches the limits of the enumerated powers of the Constitution, abuses the general welfare clause, and if you proceed in this direction, there are going to be problems. Jefferson reads it and is even more incensed. He doesn't even write Henry Clay back. Madison's the nice one. He writes Henry Clay and says, I'm going to explain to you why your position is wrong. Jefferson reads it. He writes his friend in the Virginia State Assembly and says, essentially, we need to resurrect the principles of 1798, the nullification of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And if they cram this tariff and the internal improvements through, we need to pass a resolution out of the state of Virginia that declares them unconstitutional. Jefferson dies a few months later. It's one of his last acts of political life. He was trying to build a counter movement to Henry Clay's American system in the Virginia legislature. So he dies in 1825, about 6 months or so after this political movement started. So you have, at the very end of their lives, Jefferson and Madison, even though they had wavered in their presidencies, they return to their principles when they see Henry Clay coming up. The other problem Henry Clay encounters, and I don't think he intended this, although he certainly took advantage of it, when you start offering protection and favors and public expenditures on programs galore and national banks to finance it, it attracts special interest groups. So the 1820s as a decade becomes synonymous with the origin of the political lobby in the United States. That's when all the corrupt interests start to descend on Washington, D.C. and start handing bags of money to congressmen to get favors inserted into legislative bills. And very quickly, it's these tariff bills that turn into the pork barrel of their day. They're like the omnibus bill that we have today, or whenever Joe Biden pushes through these massive packages that no one's ever read in full detail, but they're thousands upon thousands of pages. They're the direct descendant of the tariff bills of the 1820s. And that's what happened in the Tariff of Abominations as part of a legislative strategy that they essentially allowed all of the different interest groups to individually, through the congressmen they had paid off and bribed, to put in their favors, and then they aggregate it together in the same bill, and everyone gets what they want, and you get this massive multi-hundred-page bill that has favors galore to everybody, and it becomes politically impossible to defeat it as a result of that. And that becomes tariff politics. So from about 1820 onward, tariffs are seen as the moment in which congressional history is infused with the absolute worst elements of corruption in the 19th century. Now that adds to that when they have the development of the railroads, which are another part of internal improvements, the railroads start giving money to congressmen. And there's a land component because the railroads start to go west. It starts to become politically powerful to determine which cities the railroad line goes through. If you're subsidizing a route to California from the east, if you are able to secure a railroad hub in your city, that means wealth and prosperity comes there. And oh, by the way, the federal government is going to give land grants to the railroad companies that are also in their pockets and exchanging money. And the railroad companies can turn around and sell that land and run a whole bunch of investment schemes. It's just everything you think about the fat cat stories of the robber baron age. It's not really capitalism that's driving this, it's cronyism in government, and it all originates in the various planks of the American system of Henry Clay, whether it's tariffs directly, land grants to the railroads, internal improvements to subsidize transport, which eventually comes to the railroads, and then debt finance of it all. So you got the whole system there. The American system is really the crony system. It's not an independent intellectual tradition, although they do try to dress it up in an economic literature. The two figures that come of age around the same time as Henry Clay, it's a father and son team of economists out of Philadelphia, Matthew and Henry C. Carey. They're pretty obscure today, or at least until very, very recently. They had fallen by the wayside. They lost the free trade debate versus Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the economists of the 18th and 19th century that argued for the superiority of free trade, basically the precursors of laissez-faire theory. And then Matthew and Henry Carey were the interventionists. They were the centralizers. They were the advocates of an active, economically involved federal government. They have some followers that don't really pick them up so much in the United States. They're able to influence some of the tariff politics at that time, but by the end of the century they've lost the economic intellectual debate. But they do have some followers that are adopt their philosophy and approach and adopt the Clay system's approach in Germany in particular. So there's another fellow by the name of Friedrich List who comes over to the United States in the 1820s, and he reads Clay and he reads Alexander Hamilton and he reads a bit of the Careys, and he goes back to Germany and writes a textbook that's an argument for economic intervention and protectionism. It becomes famous at the end of the 19th century because the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck becomes a prominent adopter of this alternative system of political economy. That doesn't end all that well. There's a very ugly legacy there. But again, we go back to the chart and notice, remember, the first half of the 19th century, really until about the Civil War, you have these back and forth, first a really, really high tariff rate, and then it drops down and it's gradual liberalization. This is done intentionally because free trade is winning the debate. But something happens in the eve of the Civil War, not during the Civil War itself, but the eve of the Civil War. Southern states are starting to secede. Congress, this is the month, 2 months before Abraham Lincoln's inaugurated, Congress is thrown into chaos because states are withdrawing their delegations. South Carolina leaves the Union. Its senators and representatives leave. There's just a whole wave of secessions about this, and everyone's in a panic because they're trying to figure out, well, how do we stop the Civil War? There's compromise measures over what's going to happen to the future of slavery. As inauguration day is approaching, the compromise measures are not getting all that far, or they're not satisfactory to any of the parties. But in the backdrop of all this, some opportunists, one of them is Senator Justin Murrill of Vermont, and then James Fowler Simmons of Rhode Island. They are protectionist cronyists. They were representatives of the Henry Clay School of Political Economy, and they view the opportunity created by the chaos on the eve of the Civil War as a chance to revive and resuscitate the tariff. So they basically call all their lobbying interests and invite them in, and they rush a bill through committee, and it passes against the backdrop of all this chaos and just barely slips through right before Lincoln's inaugurated. And we refer to that as the Murrill Tariff Act. And what it did, and you can see there on the chart, it jacked up rates on tariffs almost overnight. And by the end of the Civil War, it settled in. It has so much of a crony political interest built up behind it, it's impossible to repeal it. So for the rest of the 19th century, it's basically a war in Congress to try to repeal the outgrowths of the Murrill Tariff Act. They eventually do that, and you can see that on the chart in 1913. See, suddenly, after decades and decades of Murrill-style tariffs and its successors, in 1913, the tariff plummets. Why? Because of a really ill-conceived flanking move. This flanking move is something we refer to as the 16th Amendment today. So in 1909, a tariff revision was proposed, and the free traders realized that they had no chance of ever defeating this in Congress because there's so much money, so many corrupt lobbying interests that have captured that aspect of the government, they can't do anything. So one of the senators from the free trade side, that's Joseph Weldon Bailey of Texas, comes up on the floor and he says, I'm going to announce a proposal. And that proposal, this is 1909, is what if we adopt a new tax system that shifts all the revenue needs of the government over to the income tax, and it'll be a very low income tax. It'll be like 5%, and only on the wealthiest Americans. And that means we no longer need the tariff to generate revenue. So we get rid of it, and we can have a tax cut on the tariff side, and we cut them for revenue reasons. This also means the protectionists no longer get all their favors. So it's a really clever tax swap move that he proposed. And he had every intention of having a low, stable income tax to replace the revenue needs. There's no longer a compelling reason to give protection. We free up trade, we free up the economy, we get off of this American system and its successors. That's a political cartoon from it. You can see there. This is from the protectionist side. He said that the Democrats, which Bailey was, are trying to seal up the American economy in a free trade jar with a tariff revision wax and an income tax lid. So that was the debate that happened in 1909. And what happens is, out of this debate is born the 16th Amendment. It wasn't because the rich were getting too rich and the poor were getting poorer and we needed to stabilize inequality, is the nonsense that you'll hear in a typical high school history textbook. You can go back and read the debates. That's almost non-existent there. What they're really debating over is whether they should swap the revenue systems. And for the first couple of years, it works, actually. I mean, you see right there, the tax system based on the tariffs drops. It plummets overnight from about 1910 to the end of the decade. Rates just drop down, and they only have a really, really low, stable income tax for the first couple of years. But there's a problem that emerges. Here's another graph that shows a little zoomed in. And that problem is, you can see where the money starts to arise from. The black line is the income tax after it's adopted in 1913. The US government figures out that income taxes are much, much more lucrative at drawing revenue out of the American public, and they start to jack up the rates. And they do this accidentally. The way they discover it is the build up to World War I. As the United States enters into World War I, they raise taxes to fund the war, and it starts bringing in billions upon billions of dollars that they had no idea, they were not expecting. So you got another problem. By the end of the war, the income tax has proven a very powerful thing, even though the tariff had fallen away. And then, unfortunately, in the 1920s, the protectionists realized, well, we can separate our cause from the revenue cause, and we'll just advocate for tariffs on protectionist grounds anyway. And that's where you get this infamous disaster of American history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. So you ended up with, unintentionally, the worst of both worlds: really high income taxes and really high tariffs by this constitutional decoupling that occurred in the 16th Amendment. Well, what did the Smoot-Hawley Tariff do in 1930? Well, there's Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley together as they passed this bill. So after the stock market crashed in 1929, all the same lobbying interests show up on Capitol Hill and say, protect us from the economic disruption of this recession that's setting in. And Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley say, well, we know the exact thing that will give you protection. We will give favors to all of your industries. You pay us off, and we'll make sure you're covered in the tariff bill, and that'll be what insulates you from the coming worldwide recession. That's the gist of the argument that they made. So it was intended as a stimulus package. We protect American industry, we'll survive the recession just fine. And they thought that's what was going to happen. Instead, you get the famous spiderweb graph over here on the left that shows the total volume of world trade in the wake of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff when it's adopted. So January 1929, you can follow the spiral downward in dollar amounts of world trade over the course of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff's implementation. And the reason here is, when the United States decides to tax other countries, what do? They retaliate. And they adopt their own tariffs in return, and pretty soon it kills off all commerce abroad. Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley neglected their basic economics, their basic political economy. they did not realize at the time, or maybe they did and they just didn't understand the mechanisms behind it, that the biggest export industry in the United States was agriculture, food products. What happens if you kill off imports and every other country in the world retaliates? They no longer want to buy your exports because now they have tariffs against you. If you're a farmer in the Midwest and you just lost your international market, but you have a mortgage to pay on your farm, and you go down to the bank and say, I don't have money to pay my mortgage. And then other farmers will say, wait a minute, you don't have money to pay your mortgage. I don't have money to pay my mortgage. Next thing you know, the banking system in the Midwest is insolvent because there's no money coming in, and yet there are loans out. And they don't have any reserves to cover the volume of loans when there's no income stream coming into agricultural products because of the export problem. It turns the Great Depression into a Great Depression. It turns a regular depression into a Great Depression, effectively. All of this protectionism. So it's basically the worst possible thing they could have done in that era is exactly what they did. And if you read the speeches from the time, the defenders and proponents of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, there's a representative from New York, Hamilton Fish, who's one of the major architects of getting this bill through the House of Representatives. He goes on the floor in 1930 and reads that 1824 speech by Henry Clay articulating the case for the American system. It says, we need the American system to solve the Depression. So it was a conscious, intentional revival of Henry Clay that got us the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Of course, we know that this is an absolute disaster. One of the only silver linings that came out of the entire New Deal is that after the Smoot-Hawley tariff is adopted, it's so bad, it's so disruptive to international trade, they realize the effects are terrible afterward, within moments of this thing passing, that the whole thing backfires. Congress knows that they've messed up so badly that they basically cede the power of tariff setting to the president, and they say, we're going to hand this over to the executive branch to negotiate tariff reductions. And that's what we've had ever since the mid-1930s. Is what gives us the GATT and then eventually the WTO is efforts to reduce the tariff rate. And that brings us up basically to where we are today. Why do tariffs resurge? Well, it's the interest groups coming back. And with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to discussion and questions.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Phil. No, I was just going to say thanks, Phil. Charlie, this is more your angle here. Let's see, I see a hand up. It's yours. Okay. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, and the other Charles has his
And
hand up as
Charles, the
well.
other Charles too. Start with Charlie. Yeah.
Start with me.
Yep. Yep.
So when I was a Republican congressional staffer in '94, we passed NAFTA, and I was becoming a libertarian then. And Ron Paul was saying, don't fall for the temptation of internationally managed trade.
Yeah.
Be brave and just unilaterally cut your own tariffs and let that serve as an example. And indirectly, that would lead to foreigners reducing their retaliation. Let's talk about that, because the WTO process, or GATT, I'm sure there's some benefits because it's, there's got to be. But there's also some costs to ceding authority to these globalists who exploit these international bureaucracies just like they exploit domestic bureaucracies.
Exactly.
So how do you, in your libertarian mind, weigh the efficiencies of international negotiating bodies versus the politics of the capture of them?
Well, they're a double-edged sword, and they have been basically since their formation. Unfortunately, things like the WTO have succumbed to mission creep, where trade is a very expansive term, but what if trade starts to include things like climate regulation? Because goods that cross borders have supposedly effect on things that climate activists care about. What if international trade has implications for intellectual property across borders? And there are subsequent agreements that come out of that. Um, Unfortunately, what we found is some of these international bodies like the WTO are susceptible to rent seeking themselves. And they're also susceptible to bad actors abusing them in retaliatory ways. So one of the major problems that's emerged in the WTO era is that the United States and the European Union are often locked in battles of trying to get sanctioned retaliatory tariff measures on each other by playing it out in a legalistic court system, which completely defeats the original purpose, which was to reduce barriers all around. So I think there is some credibility to Ron Paul's concern that occurred back in the early 1990s when they were debating and adopting NAFTA, even more so when the WTO came into existence and formed in the mid 1990s, and some successor rounds to that. What I think it comes down to for a libertarian perspective is we have to ask the question, what exactly is the WTO being used for? At its best moments, it's been used as a mechanism to bring multiple countries to the negotiating table to lower tariffs all around. At its worst moments, it's been used as a bureaucratic rent capture mechanism for interest groups working through, whether it's through the nation state or working through international bodies, you name it, to do backdoor regulations in other ways. And one of the unfortunate effects is I think the WTO has damaged its reputation because it has become susceptible to interest groups. Now, at the same time, Congress is not a counter answer to that, because Congress is susceptible to some of the same problems as we've seen historically, going all the way back to the Smoot-Hawley era and before. So the real answer here is that this is a problem endemic to government itself, is it's highly susceptible to special interests capturing, taking over, and extracting rents, whether that's at the national level or the international level.
If I can follow up,
Sure.
and because that's completely true, government, I like to say, no matter how small we make it, it's never going to be under the control of you or me. It's always
Yep.
going to be under control of those with the money. And maybe it's Jefferson was right that we have to do the hard work of advocacy. I mean, that group of fellas in the 1913 area, they gave us the income tax, the Fed, direct election of senators, and then ruined this past century with entrance in World War One.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, shouldn't we? And then your statement that Congress turned over tariff discretion to the presidency was just dish it off these global elitists. Do we need to like just push back and say, you know, we need to get behind the Jefferson movement, nullification, advocacy, to, you know, shrink tariffs, shrink the income tax, maybe go to a fair tax, and then just educate people that these internal improvements, like Di Lorenzo wrote in that great book on American history, the history of American business or something. He talked about the corruption of these turnpikes
Absolutely.
and these
Yeah.
canals to nowhere,
Well,
and just you know, say the international method is too dangerous. We're corruptible. We just have to roll up our sleeves and educate people.
Well, I think what we're getting to here is a theme that having the government become involved in the economy is a wide open door to special interest to capture it, whether it's on the national level, the international level. That's what happens. It's like water flowing downhill. Special interests gravitate to government and they try to use these tools. So really the answer at the end of the day is constraining government from meddling in economic exchange, whether that's exchange internally or exchange at the border, exchange internationally. And then also implicit to that is, you know, if government doesn't meddle in economic exchange, it also doesn't become a party to economic activity itself through what it funds through massive national programs. So when you create a tax mechanism, as we did with the income tax, you create a debt finance mechanism, as we did with the Federal Reserve. The default assumption, and this is an educational task that we all share, is that these things are going to be abused. You can't chain up the beast by just giving them efficient mechanisms. They're going to be abused because as long as there is money on the table that could be extracted through the uses of government, there will be lobbyists and special interests out there that figure out how to get it.
Yeah, and stop them from meddling in education and healthcare and, you know, justice, and the list goes on, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Charles, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Philip. It's been incredibly interesting to hear what you've had to say today. I've got a couple of points that I'd like to make.
Sure.
You go back to 1860. The reason the high tariffs were immediately passed is the Southern senators and congressmen had got returned to their states.
Yeah.
The Northern senators and congressmen did not. Northern industry, Northern railroads, and Northern banks all wanted high tariffs to protect their interests for the very reasons you've talked about.
Yeah.
You've talked about the role of tariffs in the 19th century. Let's change the focus just a little bit for just a moment. Tariffs, if you have high tariffs, Southern cotton couldn't be sold internationally. It had to be sold
Domestically.
the nation. Okay. If you had low tariffs, then the cotton went out the gate and the Northern industries were under competition. All right. So if tariffs, one way or the other, really had no impact on slavery or anything else, it had a complete impact on what happened in the United States. And by that, I mean, what happened when you had high tariffs is not only did the Southern states were not allowed to sell their cotton to the English because of our high tariffs on English products coming in, they also saw the tariff income go where? To the Northern banks,
The Northeast. So
Northern
it's
railroads,
concentration.
and the Northern canal systems and the Northern subsidies to their extinction. And that's the only reason the South ever left the nation. This business about slavery, I'm sorry, that's just garbage. It was all about the tariffs. And we saw proof of that as soon as they pulled out of Congress. What did the North do? They raised the tariffs out of sight. The role for tariffs is, one, to fund government to some degree, but two, and this is the part that I respectfully disagree with your analysis, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a world. And laissez-faire works fine if everybody plays fair, but nobody plays fair. And the only opportunity under sovereignty, forget the giveaway of the sovereignty with all these other global organizations, and I completely agree with you there, is through the implementation of tariffs. Like, okay, you want to use slave labor out there in Uyghurs, and you want to charge 15 cents for a t-shirt instead of $5 because of that. Well, we're going to put a stop to that because that's unfair competition. Now, the problem is, as you know, unfair competition can be used as a crutch to subsidize industry in an improper manner. So the role of government then is to have the tariffs, maintain the tariffs, and then turn around internally and act as umpire to make sure there's no vertical integration, no horizontal integration, and no monopolies form. You know, they can't be involved with it. People talk about public works projects. Name one that couldn't be done by private enterprise. The answer is you won't be able to unless that project is not economically feasible. And letting the government do it through debt or however they do it doesn't change that basic reality. A turnpike system that was privately owned would be far superior to what we have now. Railroads overbuilt because of the reasons you've talked about in terms of the subsidies they got and the land grabs and the money and the pork barrel politics and everything else went on it. But at the same time, the transcontinental railroad that was built was so corrupt and so useless and such a waste it was almost not usable. But 15 years later, the privately built Northern Pacific Railroad would achieve the same goal using private funds. So my point is the government has to be restrained and limited by finance. You got to do away with the idea of private bank fiat currency. I mean, you go back to 1913. That's what Charles has talked about. And he's exactly right. You've got to also make sure the government's role is umpire. They don't get to determine the income. They can't make statements like nobody gets left behind. Because when government says nobody gets left behind, nobody gets ahead. And that's the end of capital formation and ultimately the end of your country. And I'll leave you with this comment from the Sparta king. They were having one of the very many wars among the city-states, and one of the city-states went to Sparta and asked the king, do you see us as friend or foe? And the king looked down at him and smiled and said, neither. And that should be the basis of our tariff strategy. No nation is a friend. No nation is an enemy. They are who they are, and they do what they do. And our role using tariffs would promote local industry and local ownership. And I also would use the same tariff approach on foreign ownership of American banks, American industry, and everything else for the very same reason.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that. I guess my main answer would be is I think we've got something like the old ring of power problem, as you use the analogy from the Lord of the Rings movies, is whether we use this tool to try to do good for ourselves or do we destroy the tool? You seize the ring of power, and what we find out is it has corrupting elements to it. Even if the best intentioned person gets control of that power, they always tend to corrupt. It's back to the Lord Acton principle. And this is why I'm leery of trying to weaponize the tariff power in an ostensibly beneficial way for our side, is that as soon as it happens, you see a repeat of what occurred even in the Jefferson and Madison administrations. People that were philosophically and on principle committed to free markets and free trade and free exchange start to be bought off by the interest groups that gravitate to the use of that power. And I just can't find a moment in history when anyone's ever been able to successfully insulate themselves from that corruption. Milton Friedman used to say, is like, well, why do we use a tool to advance protectionism, a tariff, which essentially functions the same way as a blockade? Blockades are used in war to cut off the enemy. Why would we cut off ourselves with an economic blockade? And I think there's some real wisdom in that, to ask the question is, do these things achieve what they want to do, what we purport that they do, vis-a-vis, do they just simply empower new interest groups that become entrenched and impossible to ever dislodge? And I think the pattern of history shows pretty strongly that it's the latter course. It's the interest groups corrupt and entrench themselves and become impossible to dislodge.
Well, my quick response to you is twofold. One, you're disregarding the impact of the fact that we sold our treasury to private bankers in 1913. So that's completely skewed the results coming forward. And number two, setting all that aside, if at all possible, how in the world can you, with a straight face, say we are better off under NAFTA, GATT, and all the other obligations and the open trades that we've had than we would have been with a tariff system and industry owned by Americans? Now, I'm sorry, on that we must agree to disagree.
All right.
What about that? Madison said, let's have a flat tariff rate. And we know the Orwellian nature of an income tax. It's guilty until proven innocent with your income. So I think taxing sales is definitely better than taxing income.
I agree with you there. Yeah.
And instead of, I would go for fair tax or national sales tax, but I get the idea. If you're going to tax sales, start with the imports.
Yeah.
So Madison's flat income tax, flat tariff tax. Is that libertarian enough to start with a flat tariff that Madison proposed in 1789?
Well, that would certainly get us back on track to what the original intention was. So if we passed a constitutional amendment that said we are abolishing the 16th Amendment, repealing it, the income tax is no more, and a flat, non-discriminatory national sales tax was implemented in its place at a single rate, so that would be the key. In designing it, you'd have to specify that you cannot have different rates for different industries, different rates for different goods. So a single rate does have some advantages there. Why that would never be politically popular is because it would yield a much, much smaller treasury intake than anything that we're used to. And that on the fiscal side cuts off all of the spending on the other side. So I see that as, yes, that would be a fun thing to play around with and consider as an alternative. It's one of the great what ifs of history. Had Madison won that battle and adhered to his principles and been able to defeat the protectionists in that first Congress, and had given us a single flat rate on all imports, we'd have a very different system of government today.
And then the flip side, how do we control internal improvements?
Yeah.
They're always going to be corrupt and roads to nowhere, bridges to nowhere. That's another topic for another day, I guess, because we're kind of out of time, Jim.
Yes, we are. Linda, you have a minute for a quick question.
I have a question if you can answer. I have a small social security income in Baltimore, and I have my pension from Europe. And this pension is taxed in Europe, and also the gross income And also the gross income is taxed
Taxed in the US.
also here. And I complain why you don't tax what is left after the taxes overseas, and you tax the gross income again. Therefore, is no more left for my pension.
Mhm.
Do you know about that? How I
Yeah.
can act against?
Yeah, it's one of the great problems of the United States tax system is we're one of the countries that double taxes. We tax income from abroad and we tax income made at home, whether the tax has been paid elsewhere or not. It is grossly unfair. Unfortunately, it's a part of the system that's been built up intentionally because that gets more money for the federal government. So you're dealing with a directly abusive and corrupt tax system.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill, you want to wrap up any last words and at least tell people how they can reach you? Or?
Absolutely. So I write quite a bit about the tariff history of the United States. AIER.org, we publish regular content on this. And, you know, as just a final parting thought, I'd urge people, if you hear the American system put forth as if it was a distinctive system of economic thought that's rooted in the American founding, it's not. It's actually the one that rejects the most principled exercises of economic wisdom from Madison and Jefferson. They didn't always adhere to their own principles, but that's you know, economic freedom, economic exchange is as true to the American founding as the First and Second Amendment, as independence from Britain, as low taxation, as an original cause of the American Revolution. So I would urge people to read up on the history there and not buy some of the lines that are being sold, whether it comes from the interventionist far left or the interventionist elements on the right.
And where do people find you?
AIER.org is the main place that I publish, and I'd encourage you to check out the website.